Close your eyes properly. You're in a control room with a pen, blank paper, and a sealed envelope you can't touch. You don't know where the target is. You don't know what it is. You're told one thing. Describe what you perceive. You stop. Someone behind you writes something down. Somewhere else, another room, is doing the same thing. And somewhere else, again, a third. None of you know each other. None of you know the target. But if enough of you describe the same thing, the envelope gets opened. And if what's inside matches what you drew, this stops being a curiosity. It becomes a program. A funded one, a classified one. Because during the Cold War, the most dangerous words in intelligence weren't "we know." They were, what if they're doing this too? And once that question is asked, you don't get to ignore it. By the late 1960s, the United States intelligence community had a problem. Not a confirmed threat, not a weapon they could photograph, a possibility. The Soviet Union was pouring resources into something Western analysts struggled to categorize. They called it psychotronics, and believe me, I tried to say that a few times. A vague, uneasy umbrella covering human perception, cognition, and influence. Remote perception, human-machine interaction, altered states. None of it fit neatly into missiles or bombers. And that made it worse, because the Cold War wasn't just about weapons, it was about asymmetry. If one side developed something the other couldn't even measure, you didn't wait for proof, you reacted. Briefings didn't say the Soviets have psychic spies, they said the Soviets believed this may be possible, and that was enough. Belief drives funding, belief drives research, and belief, especially in Moscow, had a habit of becoming policy. So inside the Pentagon, the question wasn't, is this real? It was, what happens if we ignore? And they don't. Early tests were crude, subjects separated from targets, targets sealed in envelopes, information reduced to shapes, textures, distances, no feedback, no lead-in. Just describe what you perceive. And occasionally, uncomfortably, the descriptions overlapped. Not clean matches, not Hollywood accuracy, but similarities enough to make analysts pause. Enough to make someone higher up say, run with it. This wasn't about predicting the future. It was about locating objects, facilities, equipment, hostages, things that already existed, just out of reach. And when even partial descriptions lined up with known intelligence, the program didn't get laughed out of the room. It got renamed and renamed again. Grill flame, center lane, sunstreak. Each new name meant the same thing. Someone was still signing the paperwork. And you don't quietly fund something like this unless you're afraid of what happens if you don't. Right. I owe you the good news and the bad news. The good news is this project, Stargate, was real. Not a rumour, not a fringe experiment. It existed. It was funded. It was reviewed. It ran for more than 2 decades. People were trained, reports were filed, budgets were approved. This wasn't a bloke in a room doodling spirals for a laugh.
Speak for yourself, Shane. I once doodled a spiral, labelled it classified, and walked out with 6 months funding.
85? You weren't even in the programme.
Didn't matter, Shane. If you carried a clipboard and looked confident in the 70s, they would fund you.
Oh, 85, dearie me. But that is exactly the problem, because here's the bad news. Despite all that time, despite all that money, despite all that scrutiny, it never delivered what it promised. Not reliably, not operationally. not in a way intelligence agencies could depend on.
Yeah, turns out I've got a feeling isn't actionable intelligence.
Yeah, that's right, 85. And once that became impossible to ignore, the question stopped being, does this work? And became, why did it keep going? Strip away the hype, the documentaries, the late night TV, and Stargate doesn't vanish. What survives is smaller but real. Stargate wasn't a single experiment, it was a framework, a controlled attempt to see whether human perception could extract any usable signal from noise. This wasn't seance nonsense.
Didn't always look like that from the outside. I once walked past a session wearing a wig and a trench coat for a laugh. 3 psychics drew me.
I can just imagine you in a trench coat, 85, bloody hell. Sessions were blind, targets isolated, feedback delayed or removed. They didn't ask, what do you think it is? They asked, what are the shapes? What's the texture? Is it natural or artificial? The goal wasn't visions, it was pattern overlap, and under tightly controlled conditions. Some participants performed slightly better than chance, not dramatically, not reliably, but measurably enough. To show up in statistics, enough that external reviewers couldn't wave it away. That's why Stargate wasn't shut down after 5 years, or 10, or 15. It lived in a grey zone. Not success, not failure, just inconvenient. And it was never allowed to operate alone. Remote viewing was supplemental, not decisive. It didn't replace satellites. It didn't replace human intelligence.
Good job too, bloody hell. If they'd relied on half the drawings I saw, they'd have invaded a shopping mall.
Yeah, at best, it nudged analysts towards places they were already looking. Sometimes it echoed what was already suspected. Internal assessments didn't say it works, they said produces information of questionable intelligence value, which doesn't mean useless, it means dangerously ambiguous. And ambiguity is the one thing bureaucracies hate, unless they're afraid of what happens if they ignore it. Here's the bad news. If that wasn't bad enough, when Stargate was examined as a whole, not cherry-picked sessions, the cracks were impossible to ignore. The results didn't scale. Accuracy varied wildly. Promising viewers 1 week produced nothing the next. And when conditions changed, different analysts, different targets, performance dropped fast.
Yeah, that's when it starts costing real money, Shane. I once submitted, right, a drawing of a potato. They called it geologically significant.
Geographically significant. 85, you talk some absolute, I won't even say. A lot of what looked impressive wasn't predictive, it was retrofitted. Descriptions were vague by necessity, large, metallic, cold, near water. That flexibility made matches feel stronger after the fact, and that's not fraud, that's human pattern matching. Operationally, it was worse. Even when a session lined up reasonably well, you couldn't act on it. You couldn't launch a mission on feels industrial, possibly underground. You need coordinates, timelines, verification. Stargate never consistently delivered those. Over time, the program became something intelligence agencies quietly resented, not because it was ridiculous, but because it refused to die cleanly.
Yeah, that's how myths grow legs, or spiritual third eyes. I once pretended to remote view the break room fridge. Got a yogurt out of it.
By the 1990s, the conclusion was blunt. Not hostile, not mocking, just tired. The program hadn't produced intelligence reliable enough to justify continued funding. Whatever signal might exist, it was buried too deep in noise, so Stargate was shut down quietly. No scandal, no apology, just another Cold War experiment that didn't survive the paperwork. Even after everything collapsed, something about Stargate never sat right, not because it worked, but because it didn't fail the way failures usually do. Most bad ideas die fast. This one didn't. It survived audits, skeptics, leadership change. It ran for over 20 years. That doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen because everyone was gullible. Somewhere in the data, buried under noise and interpretation, something kept nudging just above zero. Not enough to trust, not enough to weaponize, but enough to stop people letting go. And that's the uncomfortable reminder. Not psychic spies, not magic, but the possibility, however small, that human perception isn't as sealed as we like to pretend, and that scares people who like clean answers. So here's the question: if Stargate failed, why did it run for 23 years? If it produced nothing, why keep renaming it? And if data was meaningless, why classify it at all? I'm not asking you to believe in psychic spies. I'm asking you to think about how institutions behave when they're scared of being wrong. Because sometimes the strangest thing isn't what they funded, it's how long they were willing to keep funding it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, guys. And as always, stay curious, my friends. Shane, out.